All right. Hello, everyone. It is 1 p.m., so we will go ahead and get started. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today for our Learning and Growing webinar, Thriving on Challenge, Unlocking Student Potential Through Risk-Tolerant Learning Environments. Our presenter today is Mandy Malden. My name is Ellen, and I am your moderator today for Hawks Learning. We will have a live Q&A session after the presentation, so please enter any questions into the Q&A as we go. And now I'm going to hand it over to our presenter.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to being here and having this opportunity to share about risk-tolerant learning environments. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, let me know if that doesn't look quite right. Good old technology. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, first of all. I am in Washington State, in Smoky, Washington State currently. I started my career teaching developmental math. And so most of what I talk about is with that in mind. In terms of many of my students, I teach pre-college math. So many of my students are, I would say, beginning learners, but they also bring a lot of anxiety into the classroom. And so that is what started my work in creating these risk-tolerant learning environments and everything that goes into that. I have a master's of education focused on adult education as well as developmental math. So that's where I come from. So to begin with, I want to propose an analogy for what our students deal with and what we deal with as educators. I like to think of my classroom and my students that are sitting in my classroom really as icebergs. I know that sounds strange, but what I mean by that, if we look at an iceberg, the top part, notice how small it is. And that's what we see of our students. That is our student sitting in the classroom. Everything else that they bring into the classroom is under the water. It's the things that we can't see. It could be past educational trauma. It could be lived trauma currently that's not even related to education. So all different things can feed into that part underneath the water that again influences student learning. Now, I also want you to think in terms of the Titanic, right? The unsinkable ship. What part of the iceberg took the Titanic down? It was the part that the captain couldn't see. And so I challenge you to think about the fact that it's the things that we can't see as educators that are most likely to make it so our students won't succeed. I began, when I first started working with students, particularly in the classroom, I would focus on basically the shallow behaviors, the not coming to class, the not turning things in. And that just created so much frustration for me because I was like, they don't care, right? What am I supposed to do? How do I make them care? But then I shifted my lens and how I started thinking about causes of those behaviors. And that got me to really focus on that part of the iceberg of the student that I couldn't see. So the risk tolerant learning environment is a huge part of allowing me to do that. Okay, now, when we think about teaching, at least for me, there's some guiding questions. The first question that I used to ask myself is, what do our students need to learn, right? Or what do they know? And I often think about that in terms of prerequisite, right? There's an expectation of what my students know when they enter my classroom, okay? What we have to add, though, is what do all of our students need in order to learn effectively. I would argue that they have to feel safe while learning. If you think about environments, maybe for a moment, think about a learning environment or a learning experience that you had that was really positive. Or you can think about a learning experience that wasn't positive. What was the difference? What worked? What didn't work? I'm just going to give you a second to think about that. Okay, so I was at a teaching conference where I gave a workshop, and there was a keynote who was really focused on trauma-informed teaching. And this creation of a risk-tolerant learning environment is important because of the trauma-informed teaching model. So Dr. Yvonne Hernandez Friedman talked about the agreements within teaching, the traditional ones versus the ones we really need to keep in mind when we're taking this trauma-informed teaching into account. Post-pandemic, there is a lot of trauma, both for faculty as well as for students. And so right now, this is even more important than it ever has been before. So traditionally, when we look at our role as teacher or faculty, we have been seen, and I know for me, I felt like, oh, I'm the person that knows everything, and I need to present myself as that. But in order to take trauma into account as we're teaching, we need to think about the exchange of ideas and having learning be collaborative. It's very different, right? It's working together to learn. You may be familiar with the term sage on the stage, and that's the traditional model where we sit up in front of a bunch of students, right? And we provide them information, and we're like dumping information into our students' minds, and hopefully they are picking it up. So this new model is, again, making an exchange and collaborative. The agreement of competition. So traditionally, we looked at student success as merit, right? We had some students that were stronger than others, some students that may be coming in with better or different skills. But now we have to think of it as, again, that collaborative piece, right? Working together. It doesn't matter the grades that students are bringing in. Counterintuitive, I do realize. We can maximize, we can create these collaborative environments by helping students identify strengths, because even students that may be weaker to start, may have lower grades to start, they still bring something to the class and can also participate in collaborating. There's no competition between students. That is critical. I know sometimes, even now when I have this central in my mind, I have some students that are getting A's all the time, and other students that are getting B's or even F's, right? And I have to purposefully think about how I'm thinking about those students. Am I having negative or positive feelings, right? And I have to take that into account, and I have to be careful that I'm not carrying past assumptions, right? And a lens that interferes with this collaborative work, so that I don't influence how I treat students, right? Everybody has to be treated and viewed equally and at the same value. So that's something that I still work at. All right, and then agreement of perfection. Traditionally, we are seen as the all-knowing person in the room. I know I used to be so afraid of making mistakes because, of course, I couldn't admit that I was imperfect. But what we have to do is we have to open and be more flexible with how we define our knowing and unknowing. Not just unknowing, right? That again, we're not perfect. And there may be things that we don't know as well. And that has to be okay. And we'll dive in a lot more about that when I get into the risk tolerant learning environment. and how to create it. Oh, and I'll also invite you, if you have questions as I'm talking, to go ahead and pop questions into chat. If I have an opportunity, I will answer questions as we go. Otherwise, there is the Q&A at the end. All right, so central to all of this is an understanding of the impact of anxiety on learning. Anxiety can be created by lots of different things, but the impact of anxiety is the same, okay? And I mentioned at the very beginning, right? Students may bring anxiety and stress as a result of past educational trauma. It could be that I deal with students who are not financially sound. Some of them are living in their cars. Some of them have unpredictable Wi-Fi, right? All of those things create stress and anxiety. Okay, so I want you to think about student behaviors that you may have encountered over the years. So have you ever had students that take out their phones or perhaps put their head on their desk, or maybe they slide down their chair, right? But you have a sense of, yep, they're checked out, right? I used to assume that when I saw that, it was because they didn't care, right? Oh, there's another student, right? What are they doing? It was all put on them, okay? Do some students stop attending class? Again, my assumption originally was they don't care, they have the wrong priorities, and any number of things that behavior made me think of. It is critical that we create a safe learning environment that keeps students from experiencing levels of stress that impede learning. If we're under too much stress, we literally can't learn. Our working memory doesn't work. We can't take information in and we can't process. And this is called working memory overload. So many of the behaviors that I listed before, and maybe some, and probably many behaviors that you have seen in your own classrooms, they don't have anything to do with a student's desire to learn. It's literally that they're not capable of it at the moment because their anxiety and stress level is too high. So we have to address that in order for all of our students to have an opportunity to learn. And that is where the risk-tolerant learning environment comes in. Okay, so what does a risk-tolerant learning environment look like, or what does it feel like? Okay, again, the goal is to reduce the anxiety and the stress caused by our learning environment. That's the only thing we have control over, right? We can't really impact what's happening outside of the classroom, but we can certainly impact what's happening inside. I'm going to share something. This was one of the most impactful professional development things that I did when I first started teaching, so about 13 years ago. There's something called the Faculty Experiential Learning Institute, and it's created by Diego Navarro down in California. And he talked about, students who are traditionally marginalized within our organizations, our schools, right? They often, he described a gravitational pull. And traditionally, if students begin being challenged, it could be challenged in school, it could be challenged outside of school. The gravitational pull traditionally sends them away from our classrooms and away from the school because they don't feel that it is a supportive part, right? But we need to reverse that. And he said, we need to reverse it. And there are ways that we can reverse it so that when they start struggling on whatever it is, they turn towards the school, they turn towards our classrooms, they turn towards student support services. because they see it as, yes, this is a safe, supportive environment. So this risk-tolerant learning environment is key to that, to start turning our students towards our classroom so they come there instead of running away, which again, notice one of the behaviors I mentioned was students not coming to class, right? That is a sign, usually, that something is driving them away. Okay, so with that in mind, characteristics of a risk-tolerant learning environment: students feel a sense of community with classmates as well as the teacher. It's critical that we, as teachers, also feel part of that community. Okay, and that goes back to that collaborative part of learning, right? We're not a sage on the stage. That creates distance, and we can't have distance with our students. That's another thing that's counterintuitive, right? Well, certainly when I was in school, but also as I started out teaching, it always felt like, I described this line in the classroom, right? It's like an invisible line, and it's really hard for students to cross that line to start really interacting with us. And we need them to cross that line so that we can become part of that community in our classroom. Okay, so students feel safe to take risks like working with their classmates, right? Making mistakes, asking questions both during class and to us one-on-one, and then experiencing and persevering through challenges. So the next part here is I'm going to talk about, okay, well, how do we do this? How do we get our classrooms to have these characteristics? All right, so keys to creating a risk-tolerant learning environment. It's very purposeful. It does not happen by accident. Okay, so we have to think as we do our course designs, what we can do within our content to be able to, create this risk-tolerant learning environment. I think that's also a key thing to understand. I know when I'm working with faculty, the sense is, oh, great, right? I'm being asked to do something else. I already don't have time to do what I need to do. How am I going to do this? So I want you to recognize that you can use your content to teach all of these things, to create this environment. Also, if you do it well, learning improves. So say at the beginning of the quarter or the semester, learning will likely be slower, right? Especially as we're working through creating this safe environment. But because we've created the safe environment, there are behaviors that students will feel comfortable doing that again will make them better learners. And so they will improve and things will move more quickly. So recognizing that things won't move at the same speed throughout a quarter or semester is okay. It's actually a good sign. Again, very different than certainly what I was used to as a learner and then beginning in my teaching career. All right, so we have to purposely build community in our class, not just at the beginning, but also throughout the quarter or semester. I work on a quarter system, which is fairly rare. So, everything that I talk about for myself, just to get an idea of what my experience is, it's within a 10-week quarter. Okay. So you can do it within 10 weeks. It feels like a semester. The dynamics might be a little bit different, but you have more time, and time can really help us with creating this environment. All right, normalize mistakes. My expectation is that this will be the thing that you spend the most time thinking, Mandy, what are you talking about? This is totally counter to anything that I've ever done or how I have viewed my relationship with mistakes. So I'm just going to put that out there. I am stretching you, but I ask that you trust me in this process. Okay, be open to some ideas that maybe are really different than what you've thought about before. And just, to try to prove the value of this, my pre-college math classes, which have the lowest retention rates on our campus, and really, they're key gateway classes. And when you look nationally at the students that take these classes, the retention rates are horrific. Once I started implementing these strategies, I accomplished 100% retention rates in my pre-college math classes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody passed, but what I noticed is those who didn't pass returned to my class, which meant they were taking responsibility for not succeeding. And that is the sign of an expert learner. Okay, so now we'll go into the next part for creating a risk-tolerant learning environment. We need to provide opportunities for retakes and/or corrections. Again, probably I'm asking you to consider doing some things that are counter to what your learning experience has been, as well as what you've done as a teacher. Okay, provide opportunities for low stakes desirable difficulties. And I will define what desirable difficulties are. And it goes to what I was talking about in terms of working memory overload. We're trying to bring students up to and push them a little bit, but we don't want to push them too far because then they literally can't learn. Okay, so this is my favorite part of this whole thing, and that is the building community in the classroom, because that is the foundation of all of this, right? If we feel that we belong, that is the foundation of feeling safe. So how do we do that? Well, I have a few things that I really enjoy, and in fact, so my quarter begins September 18th, and I'm already looking forward to the first week, because the first week I invest in some of these things that I really enjoy, and they really surprise students. So that's also fun. All right, so what I do is I start the first day of class with an interview activity. And in fact, when students come in and it's time for my class to start, I do a brief introduction of myself, and then I say, all right, now we're going to do a fun activity. We're not going to talk about the syllabus. We're not going to talk about, class expectations. We're just going to get to know each other. And the number of times that I have students look at me, walking into a math class and not immediately being drilled with like the rules and expectations, but instead having this experience of, oh, I get to talk to my fellow classmates. I love it because I know that it surprises them. So the interview activity is really lighthearted. Of course, the original interview activity, just to give you an idea of, it ages me a little bit, but it was, what's the top song on your iPod list? So now, now I'm like, your phone list, your Apple, your iTunes list? I don't know. I haven't figured out. But anyway, it just shows how long I've been doing this. But it's those sorts of things, right? It's what's your favorite music? What's your favorite food? Some of them, as the questions continue on, they start getting into some of their academic goals. But really the purpose of that is if students are sharing those things with each other, I've seen some study groups develop because I may have a couple of students that are going into nursing, right? A couple of students that are going into business. And so early on in their academic career, because they've had a chance to actually meet each other, they start making connections, which again is community, right? Not only community in our own classrooms, but they're creating community outside that will help them move through their academic career. All right, so that's a fun one. Oh, and the other part of that is very purposeful, right? Is one requirement is every student has to come up and ask me a question. Remember that line that I mentioned, that invisible line that's so hard for students to cross sometimes. I basically force them to do it, but they ask me a lighthearted question. I ask them a lighthearted question, and it just gets the conversation going. Now, a bonus to this, I ended up inadvertently, this was many years ago, having a student where their preferred name was not listed on their roster or on my roster. And I, by accident, by calling out the name on the roster, outed student. And I realized that can never happen again. So I use this interview activity as an opportunity to connect with my student, and I ask them, what is your preferred name and pronoun? I have it marked down, and so that is not going to happen again. So I never take attendance off of a roster or so the whole class can hear. So that's just a side note and something that I inadvertently benefited from doing the interview activity and having that requirement to come talk to me. So, okay. So I also provide a scavenger hunt, and the purpose for the scavenger hunt, the foundational purpose, right, is to have students actually physically go to the support services on campus that I know will help them get through my class. But they do it in small groups. That's the community building part. I find, and I know for myself, if I have to go somewhere that I've never been before and find something, find an office, find a person, it can be really scary. But when they do it as small groups, people just have more courage. And the offices know that my students are coming. My students have a question to ask somebody at the office, so say advising, right? I may have them ask a question about how do you schedule an appointment with an advisor. They've gone there, they've crossed that threshold, right? And once they've done it the first time, it's a lot easier to do it in future times. So I don't know. I mean, I have 50-minute class periods, so I've basically timed it so that they can get to each of the support services that I need them to. And then the last stop is to come to where they meet me for office hours. So they can't say, well, I don't know where to find you, right? Or again, they've been there once, and so it will be easier for them to get there again. And then, I basically mark down, I think it's 5 points for the scavenger hunt. So they get their 5 points and they know where to find me. So that has been a really valuable activity. And notice, this is community building, right? That is a really valuable activity because they're learning about things that will help them learn, right? Tutoring centers, advising, helping make sure that they have a clear plan, right? Counseling services, all of those things are going to help them as learners. Okay, so this next part was really hard for me to start doing, and that was the first week. Instead of diving into new material, right? What counterintuitive? I had them start reviewing material that they needed to know to be able to succeed, right? To be able to start building new information on their foundational skills. But I had them work together. So they would have, different people would come in with different skill sets. And so someone who had, let's say if someone was more comfortable working in fractions than somebody else. Well, that person would take on the teacher role, right? And then you'd have other students as the student role. But then it would flip because maybe the people who more, understood at a student level would have another topic that they felt more comfortable with, and they would become more of the teacher role. And it's key to developing confidence, but also getting to know each other some more and seeing that, yeah, we do have different levels of understanding, and that is okay. what we bring to the classroom, wherever we are, is okay. It's our responsibility as teachers to create an environment that will eventually bring all of the students up to the same level. Okay, so here's that desirable difficulties, okay? Create opportunities for desirable difficulties that are low stakes. That's the key. It has to be low stakes. When students work together throughout class time, they can feel empowered and to begin to feel like a team. I use a flipped classroom model where students are introduced to concepts at home, and then in the classroom, they actually work through the material. Now, I've also really decided to commit to the flipped classroom. This is another side note, but with AI, with ChatGPT out there, this is a way for me to make sure and to be able to better measure that my students are actually learning and not just entering homework problems into ChatGPT. So that is a really big bonus of the flipped classroom. It's a better way to learn, and it reduces the potential negative impact of AI on our teaching. Okay, so Andrew Watson, who is an author, he has a store on Amazon, and I would highly recommend that you take a look at his books, because they are, while he doesn't use the term risk-tolerant learning environment, he does a lot of work about creating these safe environments. But he does describe desirable difficulties which require students to think harder before they succeed at their work and can foster deeper learning. And the desirable part is that we don't take them too far, right? We don't get them into working memory overload. Okay, here's the first big thing that I'm going to ask you to rethink. And it may feel uncomfortable, but I would also argue that we are asking our students to do uncomfortable things, right? They may see something. I'll use story problems as an example. I know when I'm going to teach story problems, my students are going to be very nervous, very insecure, and very uncomfortable. So as the expert, it may have been years since we experienced that discomfort. This will help us do that so that we can have a better idea, a better sense, a reminder of what it's like to learn when we're uncomfortable. All right, so normalizing mistakes. When I'm lecturing, which I'm doing less and less of, but I will purposefully make mistakes while lecturing. Counterintuitive, right? But it shows that mistakes are normal. Even the person sitting in front of the room can make mistakes, and mistakes are okay. And in fact, they are one of the best ways to learn, right? Okay, so don't make things perfect. Learning is messy, and students need to see that. You know, the number of times, and I remember, well, in math in particular, I was so scared to death of making mistakes that I would freeze, right? I would much rather just, or mentally, it was, well, I would rather just not do it than make a mistake while doing it. So we have to show students that learning is messy and it is okay. And this is, you know, make mistakes while teaching, call out mistakes, okay? Or invite students to see if they can recognize the mistake. Or you may not even bring it up. You just might wait and see whether students recognize it. And if they don't, then you go back, right, and correct it, show them the process. But by inviting students ahead of time to look for, recognize, you know, call out any mistakes that might happen, you're also telling them, I, as your teacher, see you as knowing enough, right? Being smart enough to be able to recognize mistakes that I might make. And that is an amazing confidence builder. Okay, so in addition to the mistake itself, we also can model how we can use the mistakes to learn, right? So you can walk them through your thought process, right? Especially if other students or if students didn't identify your mistake, then you can take them through that process and then describe very purposefully how the mistake has helped you learn. I don't know about you, but one of the most heartbreaking things is to hand back like exams, or, it applies to papers also. But, nearing the end of the quarter, a midterm, a final, I say, hey, pull out your exams, right? See what mistakes you made, see my notes. And those students who say, oh, I threw them away, I'm like, no, that shows me that they don't understand the role that mistakes play in their learning, right? And so this establishes early on to not be afraid of them, the mistakes, and how you can use them to learn. All right, practice tests, keys, and rewrite. Again, I'm going to be asking you to stretch yourself a little bit on how we as teachers show and illustrate the value of mistakes and that it's normal. Because remember, we're trying to normalize mistakes, right? So we have to have them as we're teaching. All right, so what I do in my math classes is about 2 days before I give a test, I hand out a mock exam. And with that mock exam, I hand out a key, okay? So I provide that key. You could use it, if you had papers, you could hand out, say, a draft, okay? So that they could look at an example, and, probably 2 days before a due date isn't enough time, so you'd want to shift whatever would make sense for you. But provide a paper that they can look at from the educator's side, right? Have it have things that maybe you anticipate they would make mistakes in their own papers, right? That are to try to help them identify things to think about as they're writing their papers. But the really important thing about this is to make sure the paper, the key, has some mistakes in them. I know, right? Because we're supposed to be perfect, right? That's one of the original agreements that I talked about, right? It's that perfectionism. But here's the thing, and the interview activity has been key for community building. The mistakes on my keys has been the number one thing that I have seen in terms of building confidence in my students, actually creating a fun environment. And then it allows me to see the thinking, right? If they find a mistake, I then notice I provide extra credit, right? For each mistake that they identify, they have to describe the mistake, because sometimes or often talking through something can show weaknesses or gaps in understanding. I'll have students come up and say, I don't know, I just know it's not right. Okay, you're right, it's not right, but that tells me they're not understanding things at a level that they need to, right? And so they do that, they show me how they would fix it. But if they can't show me how to fix it, that's okay too, right? Because then we can work through it together. Now, if I see students come up and they have a common challenge in describing what the mistake is or describing how to fix it, I use that as an opportunity to then go teach the whole class, right? Usually I use a different problem than what on my mock exam, but boy, that's so helpful. It has them interacting with me again, right? They're moving over that line, that invisible line. They're seeing that I think they have enough knowledge, right, to identify my mistake, and I'm not perfect. So this is, I would say, in terms of building confidence and really feeding into that relationship between teacher and students, but then also students, because they work together on this, the most effective thing. All right. So provide opportunities for retakes or corrections. When I started doing this, and I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do this, yeah, it takes time, right? It does. It takes time. So trying to think in terms of, okay, how do I manage this so that I give students the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, right? But also not make a schedule that's so crazy for myself, right? That I run out of time. Yeah, that's a balance. And so I'll just set that out there because I know when I first started doing retakes, when I talk to faculty, that's kind of the first place where people settle, right? Is that how am I going to manage this? So I'm going to share how I do it, but know that just offering a few opportunities for retakes can really be a huge positive impact for students. Okay, so most importantly, this changes students' relationship with grades. Now, there's something called the growth mindset by Carol Dweck has done research on that over at Stanford for decades. And I'm not really going to go into that, but the growth mindset basically helps students shift their understanding of learning and has them focus more on the process rather than the grade. And we can purposely develop environments that help them do that. Okay. And this is one way. It's basically saying, and I tell my students, yeah, it would be great if you understood how to do fractions by December 1st, right? Whatever. But what if you understand it on December 8th? Is that bad? Well, no. And so by offering retakes, they're being given an opportunity to say, oh, I didn't do very well on that exam, right? So use the exam and your mistakes to learn, which we've already modeled, right? And then you can retake that exam and see your improvement. Almost every student where I provide this opportunity and have modeled the how to use mistakes and normalizing mistakes, they always improve on their exams. But again, I'm not just saying, here's a retake opportunity. I am modeling, I am teaching, I'm being very purposeful around showing them how to use that exam with mistakes to help them with their retake. Okay, when students take a test or submit a paper and earn a grade without the opportunity to correct their work, it increases anxiety, right? I know, oh my gosh, as a student, I would sit down and be like, oh my gosh, I have to get a good grade. And that anxiety alone can make it really difficult to function on your test. So remember that all of this is trying to reduce anxiety and maximize the ability to learn. When my students know that they have a retake opportunity, they are able to relax, and believe it or not, their grades improve, right? If I were to, over the years, right, when I didn't offer retakes, the average grades on exams were lower than they are since I've started offering retakes. It's a direct link and demonstration of the importance of maximizing our working memory, right, by reducing anxiety and stress. Okay, retakes and corrections show students that you believe they can improve, right? It's not, oh, you got a C, so you're a C student. Instead, it's like, you got a C, right? Let's go keep learning, right? I'll work with you. Here's the tutoring services that you visited during your scavenger hunt, right? And then they can go and have another opportunity to do it. And when they see improvement, that is also building confidence in their ability to learn. Okay. For me, one of the biggest measures of success outside of retention rate, but of this model, is I have students come back to me and say, you know what, Mandy, because of your class, I finally know how to learn. And it's not that they just know how to learn in math. They know how to learn in English, in history, right, in science classes, because we have normalized and taught them very purposefully how to learn. Okay, so I want you to spend just a moment, and you're welcome to pop things into chat as you're thinking about these things, but I've thrown a lot of different stuff out at you today. And I know that some of them may seem really counterintuitive, right? Really different to what education has been like for us for years. So I just want you to take a minute, and I want you to think about whether you've already been creating a risk tolerant environment, and if so, how? Were there any suggestions that I've made that resonated with you? Maybe maybe it was just like, well, that's an interesting thought. So maybe you're not thinking yet about whether you would want to implement it or how to implement it, but did it resonate with you? Were there any ideas that you didn't like very much? That's okay too. And if so, why? And I find that question particularly important because if there's something that is uncomfortable for us, maybe that's the one that we should actually try, right? Again, counterintuitive, but our students are uncomfortable. If we become uncomfortable, it's a learning thing for us too. And it's a way for us to model. I will share with my students if I'm feeling challenged, if there's something that I'm bringing to the class for the first time, because they have to see us not just as the expert, but an ongoing lifelong learner. All right, identify two things. So this is a challenge to you. Identify two things that you will do in your classes to work towards a risk-tolerant learning environment. You don't have to change everything to start, right? Maybe just start with an interview, right, activity at the beginning, and maybe that scavenger hunt. I mean, there's a reason that I pulled those out specifically because those are the most effective strategies that I have found over the years. But maybe there's something that you've heard about that you think would help with the building of community. So yeah, think about two things that you might do. And I'm going to stop talking for a moment and just give you a second to think about these questions. And again, if you want to pop those into chat and Q&A, you are encouraged to do so. All right. So I want to open the floor to questions. Again, I know that I have asked many of you probably to stretch, to look at our roles within the classroom differently. And so anything that I can do to help clarify things for you, help in terms of thinking about ways to implement this in the classroom, please, please, please ask questions.
Mandy, we do have actually a question that's in the chat. It says, do you tell them that there are mistakes on the key before you give it to them?
Yes. So basically, when I hand out the key, I say, and not just to up the challenge a little bit, there aren't always mistakes. So at the very beginning, again, I teach quarters, right? The first time I hand out a key, I say, okay, there may be mistakes on here. This is a key that I've created. There may be mistakes if you find them, right? And then we go through that process. So telling them that actually every time I hand out a key helps to normalize that. So yes, it's important that they recognize it as my mistake. And I don't tell them whether it was, on purpose, right, or accident. I don't know what they're going to assume, but I do use it as an opportunity to also kind of spark that thinking about mistakes. So yeah, I don't hide the fact that they would be mistakes of mine.
All right. And our next question is, how do you prevent burnout with retakes and circling back to other assignments that improve the student's ability or understanding of the assignment?
Yeah, so I will admit early on, I didn't have it right. But what I would encourage you to do is think about, okay, early on, right? I'm really focusing on helping my students become stronger learners. So maybe I would provide retake opportunities on, I usually have about 5 exams plus a final at the end of the quarter. So I may provide retakes for the first, say, 3 exams, right? And maybe I have a couple of assignments that are kind of unique. And so I would provide redo opportunities on those. And then because that like activity is teaching them how to use their exams to learn, then it becomes a little bit less important as we move throughout the quarter or the semester. So planning your sort of outside work with having that be more at the beginning of a quarter or semester can help. Now I have, because I don't have, let's see, I have a max of 22 students in my classes, and I'm super lucky about that, right? And I'm the first to admit that. But that can get overwhelming if I have multiple classes, right? So I would just look at, earlier on in the quarter for me, I have less like prep that I have to do. So I know I have more time for doing those retakes. And in reality, remember that allowing the retake is showing students that there's more to just an initial grade. So it may turn out realistically that you don't have the time to do it that many times, right? But just providing the opportunity once or twice can really start building that relationship with mistakes and allowing them to learn how to use them. Now, another way that you can do it is correction. So it's not, I don't know, I find it's not quite as effective, but corrections take a lot less work for regrading because you don't have to create another exam, right? You don't have to do full regrades. So I would encourage you, if retakes are hard to kind of figure out how to use, corrections are a great way to do it as well.
Okay, and then someone else says, I think it's important to acknowledge that making mistakes is not necessarily safe for untenured or contingent faculty, especially with those marginalized identities. Any input for that, Mandy?
Yeah, so I am an adjunct faculty member and um, I actually had to deal with that very thing with my dean for my division because there was this assumption, right? That because notice that means that we have a negative relationship with mistakes. And so we are basically within that same challenge, right? Of a system that doesn't like mistakes and avoids mistakes. But we have to get our students so that they don't feel that way. So I totally understand, that's a conflict between our system and then really what's best for our students. So what I did in that case is I very clearly laid out that this was a purposeful thing, right? And why I did it and the benefit that I've seen in my students for doing it. So I think it's that what I have found when I'm communicating that is, why am I doing it? What have I observed in my students while I've been doing it, right? And that the piece that seemed most helpful in communicating that was the part about being able to see the learning process that my students were going through by having them come up to me, talk me through the mistakes, and talk through the corrections. I haven't come up with a better way to do that. So yes, I completely understand that. Student evaluation improved for me. So if you're in the tenure process, from my experience, that feedback becomes better. Again, counterintuitive, right? But if you are modeling this and you're showing them that this is okay, it does have that positive impact on evaluations. And if you're in the process of tenure, or if you're wanting to try this, I actually have a meeting with my dean in about 2 hours, and I'm laying out to him what my plan is for this quarter, because I'm doing some things that are different. So that's another thing that I've sort of tried to do to prevent some challenges that align with what that question brings up too. So, that depends on the culture of where you teach, the relationship that you have with your dean. But that's another way to sort of proactively address those types of challenges.
And then we have one additional question, and it says, my students have described that they feel more exhausted and burnt out with repeated mistakes. My question was with regards to their experience of burnout. How do you provide practice and retakes without overloading your students, especially with the other courses they are taking and extracurriculars? And I will mention that Whitney also put in the Q&A. She has in-class quizzes that students are required to take, but there are online versions that will replace their score if the online quiz is a higher grade. I leave the quizzes open online for each student to use as study aids for exams.
So that last part I'll address first. That is huge. That is huge. That allows them, again, to see that, oh, they are study aids, right? And if you specifically lay that out, then hopefully we can start shifting the perspective that, again, from my experience, many students just get rid of their exams, right? And so that is modeling to them that it is, a really valuable way to help you prepare for midterms, for finals, whatever might be coming. Now, something to think about is some students, and this is more, and I mean, I could talk about this forever, but universal design for learning, which basically is, it provides opportunities for different ways of, receiving information, showing understanding of information. So there's a possibility when we shift modality, right, from say written exam to online exam, we may be creating some unforeseen challenges for our students, but not all of them. And so if it's possible to provide some choice there, I would encourage that. But I also realize that that can also create some challenge, right? But just keep that in mind. It might be that you provide, that option to do a written retake versus online retake on one exam or two exams, right? But look at the reality of your own schedule, right? And what you feel you'll be able to get done. Okay, so that's kind of that part. The other part, in terms of feeling overwhelmed, and you're absolutely right. Oh my gosh. And I'm glad that you bring that up, because I always tell my students, I know that my class is only one thing that you're doing. You have other classes, right? You have things happening outside of school, right? I deal with a lot of adult learners. So they may have families, they may be working, all kinds of different things. And so I call that out immediately. Now, the shift that I think is important and very hard to make is we are improving our students' ability to work through challenge. And so because of the skills that we're building for them, they will get to the point where for themselves, they will have a better idea of how to schedule things, right? How to prepare for retakes, how to prepare for exams. I find that their efficiency improves as the quarter or semester goes on. But another thing is, if we can focus on in the classroom those desirable difficulties. And one thing I didn't mention, but I find, and I know this was the case for me as a learner, students are afraid of that feeling of challenge, right? If they're afraid of the feeling of challenge, they often stop, which then puts them behind. And that increases, right, that sense of being overwhelmed. So by creating these desirable difficulties, and let's see, I'll try to give an example. So, oh, I've got this book on like funny math problems. So they're super lighthearted, but they can be challenging, but they're not so challenging that it will turn students off from actually working on them. But what I do is I call out at the very beginning, you will likely feel challenged, but that is okay, because if you're learning, you will feel challenged. If you don't feel challenged, it means that you know everything and you're in the wrong class, right? But what this does is it reduces the fear of that feeling. But I have to do it very carefully within my classroom so I don't send them too far so that they shut down, they freeze, right? We're dealing with fight or flight, really, or freeze. And so, again, everything that this framework is doing is helping students understand what it takes to learn, what it takes or what it feels like to learn. And all of those things can be applied to other classes. Also, prioritizing, right? I mean, I'll talk to my students about, well, yeah, there's a retake opportunity, but think about everything else that's going on, right? Does it make sense? Or what grade did you get? Does it make sense to do a retake for this? Or you need to do it another time, right? And so that's just another educational piece, is prioritizing. How do you know? So that's a long answer, but there are a lot of pieces that go into this, right? And impact things that traditional teaching, where we're just teaching content, it doesn't help with those things. But this is really focused on helping students become strong learners, which, you know, directly and indirectly addresses that burnout. So hopefully that helps clarify things a little bit.
All right, that looks like this is all the time that we have for questions. Thank you so much, Mandy, and thank you all of you that have attended. We will be emailing you a link to view this recording of the webinar once it's available. If you or any of your fellow instructors are interested in presenting for our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to our Learning and Growing website, which I am linking in the chat now for you. These are free webinars that are brought to you by Hawks Learning, an innovative educational courseware company. To learn more about our mastery-based course materials, and how Hawks can enhance learning outcomes for you and your students, please visit www.hawkslearning.com. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thank you for attending today's webinar.
Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
I'm so glad that you were able to join us, Mandy. It was a pleasure having you present for us.
Thank you. Thank you. And I encourage people, if they want to reach out, because I know I stretch people with this workshop. And so anything that I can do to help, kind of overcome that discomfort.
Oh,
I'm
well,
happy to do it.
it was great. I think the questions were great. I think it seems like everyone enjoyed. So I'm so glad that we were able to have you.
Yeah,
But yes, anything you need from Hawks, feel free to let us know, and we are happy to help.
great. Thank you so much. And well done. You're a
Thank you.
quick
It was my
learner.
first one. It was my first one.
I know. Good job. Well, I'm glad it was with me. I mean, I'm sure other people are, totally open to that, but boy, do I get that learning curve. So good job.
Appreciate it. I'm glad you were my first one because you were so nice and understanding. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
good. You're so welcome. Hopefully I'll see you in the future.
Yes, yes. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.